was well into my adulthood before I realized that I was an American. Of course, I had been born in America and had never, had lived here all my life, but somehow it never occurred to me that just being a citizen of the United States meant I was an American. Americans were people who ate peanut butter and jelly on mushy white bread that came out of plastic packages. Me, I was Italian. I remember the stories my father would tell me. For him, as I'm sure for the most second-generation Italian Americans who grew up in the 40s and 50s, there was a definite distinction between us and them. We were Italians. Everybody else, the Irish, Germans, the Polish, the Jewish, they were the Mecadante. There was no animosity involved in this. There was no prejudice, no hard feelings, nothing like that. Just, well, we were sure ours was the better way. For instance, they had a bread man, a cheese man, a fish man, a vegetable man, a freshly gloved man. They even had a man who sharpened knives with scissors who came right up to their homes, or at least right outside their homes. They were the many peddlers who supplied the Italian neighborhoods. They would wait for their call, their yell, their individual distinctive sound. They knew them all, and the peddlers knew them right back. Americans, well, they went to the stores for most of their food. What a waste. Truly, they pitied their loss. They'll never know the pleasure of waking up every morning to find a hot, crisp loaf of Italian bread waiting behind the screen door. And instead of being able to climb up into the peddler's truck a couple times a week just to hitch a ride, most of my Mecadante friends had to satisfy themselves going to A&P. When it came to food, it always amazed me that my American friends or classmates only ate turkey on Thanksgiving or Christmas. Or rather, they only ate turkey. Or rather, they only had turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, but only after we had finished the antipasto, the soup, the lasagna, the meatballs, the salad, and whatever else my mother thought might be appropriate for the particular holiday. The turkey was usually accompanied by a roast or some kind, just in case somebody walked in who didn't like turkey, and was usually followed by an assortment of fruits, nuts, pastries, cakes, and of course, homemade cookies. No holiday was complete without some home baking. None of that store-bought stuff for us. This is where you learn to eat a 7-course meal between noontime and 4 p.m. How to handle hot chestnuts and peach wedges in the red wine. I truly believe Italians live a romance with food. Speaking of food, Sunday was truly the big day of the week. That was the day you'd wake up to the smell of garlic and onions frying in the olive oil. As you laid in the bed, you can hear the hissing as they pour the tomatoes into the pan. Sunday, we always had gravy. The Mecadante, well, they called it sauce. We had macaroni. The Mecadante, you guessed it, they called it pasta. Sunday would not be Sunday without going to Mass. Of course, you couldn't eat before Mass because you had to fast before communion. But the good part of that was, we knew once we got home, we'd find the meatballs frying, and nothing tastes better than the newly fried meatballs and crisp bread dipped in a pot of gravy, which my father hated us doing. There was another difference between us and them. We had gardens, not just flower gardens, but huge, where we grew our tomatoes and more tomatoes. Yeah, our tomatoes. We ate them, we cooked them, we jarred them. We'll never forget those tomato gardens. They don't make them like that anymore. Those gardens thrived so much because we also had something else it seemed our Mecadante friends didn't have. We had a grandfather. It's not that they didn't have grandfathers, it's just that they didn't live in the same house or on the same block. They visited their grandfathers. We ate with ours. God forbid you didn't see him at least once a day. I can still remember my father telling me about, how he lived with his papa. And these stories he used to tell me, of course, in his own version of Italian English, which I soon learned to understand quite well. They owned their houses in those days. Those houses served as a family headquarters for the next 40 years. I remember how my father would tell me about his papa and how he would, he had this big garden and he used to sit there and watch everything grow. He didn't like to leave the house unless it was for some special occasion or work, and how he had to return real quickly as possible. After all, he says, nobody's watching the house. I also remember the stories about the holidays when all the relatives would gather at my grandfather's house and there'd be tables full of food with homemade wine and music. Women in the kitchen, men in the living room, and kids everywhere. My father tells me I must have had 1 million cousins, first and second, and some who weren't even related to us. But what did it matter? And he used to tell me how his papa would sit there with a cigar in his mouth and sit there in the middle of it all, grinning with a smile, his dark eyes twinkling, surveying his domain, proud of his family. He had achieved his goal in coming to America. Now his children and their children were achieving the same goals, that they were available to them in this great country because they were Americans. When my grandfathers passed away, things began to change, slowly at first, but then uncles and aunts eventually began to cut down on their visits. Family gatherings were fewer, and something seemed to be missing. Although when we did get together, usually at my parents' house now, I always had the feeling there was something missing. It was understandable, of course. Everyone now had families of their own, grandchildren of their own. They visit once or twice a year. Today, the only time you see anybody is at a wedding or a wake. Lots of other things have changed too. The old house where my father grew up, that his grandfather owned, is now covered with aluminum siding, although someone else still lives there. And of course, my grandfather's garden is gone. The last of the homemade wine had long since been drunk, and nobody covers the fig tree in the winter anymore. For a while, we would make the rounds on the holidays, visiting family. The holidays have changed too. The great quantity of food we once consumed without any ill effects is no good for us anymore. Too much starch, too much cholesterol, too many calories, and nobody bothers to bake anymore. Too busy. And it's easier to buy it, and too much is no good for you. We meet at the house now, at least my family still does, but it's not the same. The difference between us and them isn't so easily defined anymore. And I guess that's probably good, I guess. My father's grandparents were Italians, and his parents were Italian-Americans. My parents, American-Italians. I guess me and my kids are American-Americans. Oh, and I'm American, all right, and proud of it, just as my grandfather wanted me to be. We are all Americans now, the Irish, the Germans, Poles, and the Jews. U.S. citizens all, but somehow I still feel a little bit Italian. Call it culture, call it tradition, call it roots. I'm really not sure what it is. All I know is that my children have been cheated out of a wonderful place in their heritage. They'll never know my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, my grandparents, my great-uncles, and at least now they'll have all the stories that my father has bestowed on me forever.